Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of Anthro to UX. I'm here today with Jo Aiken, who is a senior UX researcher at Google and previously at NASA. So some really interesting experience. Jo, would you start by telling everybody how you got interested in anthropology?
So thanks for having me. I come to anthropology from a very random, pathway. I was always interested in working at NASA as a child and started off studying aerospace engineering as an undergrad because I thought that's how you get a job at NASA. I didn't think you could do anything else but be an engineer at NASA, so that's what I studied. Interned and co-opted all throughout high school and college, and started working at NASA full-time as a contractor. When I started to really figure out I wasn't cut out to be an engineer, I was really more interested in more of the human side of things. And unfortunately, that was also the time that the Space Shuttle Columbia accident happened. So I was part of the team that was helping with the recovery of the debris from that accident, and I was actually assigned to the investigation board as kind of my title was like historian. I was kind of like a fancy note taker because you have to remember I was fresh out as an undergrad, so this is actually a really cool opportunity career wise, albeit unfortunate events. But that was the first time I ever heard of the word ethnography. There was a consulting firm that we brought in to do ethnography. These people actually weren't anthropologists. I didn't know at the time. I know now. They weren't anthropologists, but they were doing ethnography at NASA, and I thought it was so cool. So I wound up leaving NASA and going back to grad school. And even at the time, I didn't really know where I could study ethnography. I actually researched my way into anthropology. I started with a list of degrees you could get, and I started with the A's and somehow I landed on anthropology. And that's where I, again, heard that word ethnography. I was like, I remember that from NASA, so that's really cool. So that's how I got involved, started taking anthropology classes, and I guess the rest is history.
So I'm going to come back to anthropology in just a second, but out of curiosity, why did you want to work for NASA at such a young age? I mean, aside from the fact that it's super cool, but...
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted, as a little kid, I always wanted to be an astronaut. I would always say, I want to work for NASA and or be an astronaut. It wasn't always like I had to be an astronaut, but I always wanted to do that. I mean, as like a 5-year-old watching space shuttle launches, my mom would actually let me skip school if the launch was during the school day and let me watch the space shuttle launches.
And so the experience that you had right after college, you're here, you said your title is something like historian, but obviously that must have been an emotional time. And so how did that influence what you thought about, working at NASA and the idea of, that in the future? Was that more exciting to you, like, or that you could help, or was that actually sort of scary?
Yeah, it was a little both. I can't say it wasn't scary. I mean, as I got older, even with my desire to be an astronaut and realize it's not that safe. And actually, I was that 5-year-old sitting at home watching when the Challenger accident happened. 4 or 5, can't remember. But anyway, however old I was sitting there watching that live on television. So even from a young age, I always knew it was a little bit risky. But then, of course, the older I got, the more I realized that. And yeah, when the Columbia accident happened, it was super emotional. I'm also originally from East Texas, and my parents lived in Nacogdoches, and that was one of the areas where most of the debris fell over from the Columbia accident. So yeah, it was very, very emotional time. And it was also kind of one of those things too that I think because ethnography as a method tends to, whether it's anthropologists conducting it or someone else, tends to come from this paradigm of wanting to build rapport with participants and wanting to actually serve the needs of users. And I'm sure we'll get into the UX conversation soon. But yeah, so all of that had impacted, why I decided to go away from engineering and into anthropology.
And aside from the fact that you at some point realized that the word ethnography is tied to anthropology and that NASA was hiring ethnographers, did you see a clear path, to be an anthropologist at NASA? Or were you still, just kind of hoping that if you do the anthropology route, you can kind of force your way in?
No, at the time, I just thought anthropology was cool. And I started taking classes before I even decided to make it, at the time, my master's degree. I had to take some undergrad classes, as a prerequisite because I'd never taken an anthropology course. And I was just really loved anthropology, and I love the idea of studying cultures. And I was like, hey, if the NASA thing doesn't work out, this sounds pretty cool. And it wasn't until I started my master's degree at University of North Texas and was then introduced to the UX side, or the design anthropology side, where I was like, hey, I can actually go back and apply this at NASA. And but yeah, there was still, at that point, there was definitely no clear path of how to get a job at NASA as an anthropologist.
I have a funny story that I'm not sure you'll remember, but when I showed up at UNT for what was like, I was an online student, so the visit that you do prior to it starting, we were at Doug and Lisa Henry's house and for a party, and we had briefly talked, and you told me that you were going to work at NASA, which, I mean, I guess you already were to some degree, but I had found that very interesting. I had never myself heard of, I mean, I'm well, obviously I was young in anthropology as well, but I had never even thought of it or heard of anybody working in that space. So obviously you forged a little bit of a path. Are more people there today? More anthropologists, or?
Yes and no. Okay, so first of all, I wasn't the first anthropologist to ever work. I guess we have to define too, like, what do you define as work for? So, to my knowledge, I was the first and only, to this day, the only anthropologist hired as an anthropologist as a civil servant for NASA, meaning working directly for NASA. There are tons of anthropologists who have worked for NASA in different capacities, either have been hired on later as engineers. They were also engineers who have been hired then as engineers. But mostly their anthropologists have been engaged with NASA by working as contractors, or even on certain research projects that were, needing some kind of ethnographic experience. So Jack Schuster is one of the ones that I kind of patterned, I guess, and sought out as a mentor, because he has engaged with NASA research from a researcher perspective, doing actual ethnography and stuff. And he's been doing that since the 80s. So it wasn't anything completely new. It wasn't like I completely forged a path. There just wasn't an easy way to becoming a civil servant. And as far as I know, I'm still the only one who was ever hired as an anthropologist as a civil servant. And now it's here and there, here or there, I guess, what you consider working for NASA. But today, there are a lot more anthropologists are giving NASA attention, and even I would say space exploration as a context, or the field site, giving a lot more attention. I think in the past, there's just been a handful of anthropologists throughout the decades who have been interested in space exploration, because it's a very difficult field site. You can't go there. So it's not one of those things that I think anthropologists have naturally been drawn to. And that's definitely changed in the last 5 years, I would say.
So your point about not being able to go there is interesting. I guess it's also, there's an aspect of it, one, that it's very emerging, that you can't go there, and that there's a lot of possibilities of what can go right and what could go wrong right out there. And so that makes me think of what you already said about UNT and discovering design anthropology. And I appreciate that we're eventually going to make our way to talking about UX, but what about design anthropology spoke to you?
Yeah, just the fact that it explained away a method. I think it provided the methods. I mean, it's not like design anthropology is a separate thing from anthropology. There's still, participant observation is still obviously a key method, but it kind of explained methods in a way that was useful and practical for me going to do space research, because a lot of design anthropologists either can't go to their field site, or it doesn't exist. It exists in this virtual world or a digital kind of field site where you don't physically travel. It's not like you go spending 2 years on an island. So design anthropology was great because it explained a way for me to still be an anthropologist, but to do ethnography in a very unique way.
And so can you speak to, how you got to apply some of that in NASA?
I worked in human factors engineering research, and that was like my title, engineering research scientist or something, where I was doing research started off working on habitats, mostly for Mars, but it could be for any future mission, and worked on that for about 2 years, doing basically user research of habitats and looking at analogs, people who would stay over the winter in Antarctica as research scientists, what it was like to live and work in an environment that's isolated and confined and extreme, where you can't just open the window or walk out the door because you had a bad day and you're stuck with your 4 best friends in a tiny space. Anything that represented that's what, those were my people, those were my field sites. And then I randomly, as the government does, and this is my transition into being a civil servant, was reassigned to human resources. And I thought it was a prank at first. I was like, y'all, I'm in human factors. Like, I know it's next in the alphabet, but like human resources is not what I do. But it actually was really great because I didn't do HR stuff like what you typically think about HR, but I did more employee research, I would say. And it was a type of management consulting where it was part-time, looking at, meeting with director levels, looking at their organizational culture and helping them develop their strategies, their metrics for measurements of success. It was a little bit of designing learning curriculums for managers, which all of these pieces involved, or I tried to work in as much as I could, some type of ethnography. So if I was working for a new organization, for example, safety, doing studies where I'm actually meeting with employees and finding out what is meaningful for them and their employee experience, and then working with their managers to help improve that employee experience. And it could be anything from they just want to have more happy hours to it could be they need, help improve a certain process that's just got a lot of red tape that needs to be rethought.
So you mentioned there that UX was, at some point, it seemed like the term was being thrown around at NASA. Did you learn about the term at NASA, or did you come across it somewhere else?
No, I came across it at UNT as part of my design anthropology studies. And yeah, like I said, several people at NASA, even on their business cards, have like UX something or other. But having worked in the HR department, that's how I can speak to the fact that they don't have these things on paper. You can't really apply to a job that says anthropologist at NASA because the Office of Personnel Management is the one who tells NASA what they can hire and what they can't. And it's not out of vindictiveness or anything like that. It's just, they're saying, hey, you're an engineering organization. You can hire engineers. There's just not a general awareness that anthropologists can contribute to that at the very top federal level.
So tell me a little bit about then, pivoting formally into UX. So, today you're at Google as a UX researcher. And so what got you really interested in making that transition?
Yeah, so I had done, in between my studies and being at UNT in person on campus in Dallas. So even though I was a full-time student, I was like, I'm not doing anything during the day because most of our classes were at night. I was like, I need a job. So I worked at Southwest Airlines in doing UX there as well. That was, I guess, probably my first official on paper, although my title was Customer Insights Analyst. But again, it was in one of those groups that we were UX and we called each other UX. And on the organization, it said UX, the org chart said UX. So I had already done some UX work for Southwest. I did that for about a year, and then had done some freelancing again while I was doing my PhD in UX. I was working in UX while I was getting my PhD in anthropology. So I'd already been doing UX before I came to Google. But now I guess I'm fully officially in the UX bucket. And it's weird because to be perfectly honest, I don't identify all the time as a UX anthropologist or as a UX person. I'm an anthropologist. At times I'll identify as design, but I also do organizational stuff as well. Like, even as part of my job now, I look at organizational processes and things. It's not just UX, I guess.
And so, out of curiosity, do you get to identify as an anthropologist like at Google? Not what's on your business card, but is that how you would sort of explain yourself to somebody?
Yeah, I definitely identify as an anthropologist, and I'm allowed to. In fact, I noticed one of my anthropology colleagues has on her, like the directory for employees, actually has anthropologists on there. And she just did a presentation yesterday where she said anthropologist at the meeting. I was like, I can do that. And I just had kind of forgot that, oh yeah, I can do that. I guess my technical HR job description title is senior user experience researcher. But yeah, I'm definitely able to identify. The funny story I have about that is when I was at Southwest Airlines, my boss and his boss's boss, they loved having an anthropologist on their team. And it's to the point where we would be in a meeting or they'd be introducing me to a new person or a new director, and I would be just the anthropologist. They would introduce me as the anthropologist. I was like, hey guys, I have a name. I'm like, not just the anthropologist. So they were kind of on that, we talk on anthropology a lot about like, you don't get to say you're an anthropologist or people don't understand it. They were on the other spectrum of like, they loved having anthropologists on their team.
Yeah, when you talk to different people, it really can kind of cut any way. There doesn't appear to be any kind of hard, fast rule there that would really work for everybody or every situation. I've kind of often said, understand your audience and figure out where it's valuable and where it's not, to identify that way. But so now that you're more formally in UX, even though, you've been doing some of that work for a while now, what has that transition been like, and what are you learning along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say the biggest transition for me right now at Google is coming into an industry. I mean, I worked in industry in the airlines, and like I said, I've done consulting, but this is where I've decided to make my home now. I've pretty much left NASA in terms of like I needed a new thing in my career, and I've fully embraced the industry side of doing UX. And I think that's been the biggest transition. And it's not easy, but it's not difficult. But the difficult part is really translating, some of the different terms for things. Like, for example, like in government, we have standard operating procedures or SOPs. In industry, they may not have those. Or, a certain team might have, some sort of documenting process. But these are little nitpicky nuances of just, we do the same thing. It's just trying to figure out what you call it versus what I've always called it for the last 20 years.
And how about in terms of, methods and, teamwork and just pace, any changes there coming from a big, massive organization like NASA?
Yeah, not as much as I thought, to be honest. I expected, at NASA, we had really short projects as well as the long term. Federal government is notorious for, there's a saying, working at the speed of government, because it typically is very slow. But we had short turnaround projects as well. Actually expected it to be a little bit more fast-paced in industry than I'm finding. But that could just be the team I'm on. That's one thing I would say too about not just Google, but other tech companies and other organizations in industry. It can vary, especially if you have a large company or large organization. It's going to be different in each team, pretty much. That's something I've definitely learned in terms of UX, is that a UX researcher working in one product area may have a completely different experience and job expectation than one in another product area.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even a very different focus, not just in terms of the product itself, but what's expected in terms of really kind of tactical versus strategic. And, the roles within organizations are different across organizations. They're different across, many, many different groups. So how about in terms of, in your new role, of course, being at Google, we can't, there's a lot of things we probably can't talk about, but tell me a little bit about what you think, others need to know if they want to work at an organization like Google.
Just one, especially if you're trying to get into, and this is not just Google, for probably any tech company, is just to be flexible in your expectations of what your job is going to be like. Because like I just said, it could be different depending on what team you're on, depending on what product area you're on. For example, I do research for internal people. I do basically research for other Googlers. I help make their experience better. I don't work for a product area that's public facing. In other words, I don't make anything like, a Nest camera or an app or anything like that. So all of my users are internal employees. And I have a very different mode of operation than, other people, other anthropologists or other UX researchers in those public facing areas. So the biggest thing I would say is just to be, don't go in and with your guns blazing and like, I'm going to do ethnography every day and it's going to be glorious. You're probably not going to do ethnography every day. You're going to have to do, or if you want to be marketable, you may have to do some surveys. You may have to be willing to do those surveys, even though you may hate quantitative stuff. And that's fine. We don't all have to like it, but I'm just, for argument's sake, in terms of wanting to be marketable, the more flexible you are in your methods, the more flexible and open you are to different employee experiences yourself, I think the better off you'll be.
Working internally, on in support of, the needs of other employees, there does seem to be like a fair opportunity there to bring in aspects of organizational anthropology. And so can you maybe just speak to that a little bit? Like what have you learned that, we as anthropologists can bring to UX that maybe is not talked about enough?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. And I think one, with regards to the organizational piece, is that because as an anthropologist, we tend to see things holistically. For example, if I'm trying to improve the user experience of an employee, personally, I'm not just concerned with how they use an internal tool. I'm also curious what their workplace is like. Are they fully remote? Or are they working at the office and it's very noisy, and that's therefore going to impact their interaction with this internal tool that they're using? Things like that. That's something that we definitely bring to the table, that especially people who are interviewing in UX need to highlight when they're interviewing with managers, is like, look, this is the way I just think. You can't switch it off. We can't stop thinking like anthropologists, or at least I know I can't. So I think that's something that we bring that's a little unique than other UX research other disciplines that go into UX research. Not that they can't, but I'm just in general, we tend to think more holistically. And then on the piece too of like, I guess something that's not talked about a lot within anthropology, or at least within our university programs, is the emphasis on needing to be, needing to use multiple methods and knowing which one to choose and when. And particularly, and I say this all the time to students that I talk to, you may not like the quantitative stuff, but I'm telling you, if you can latch on, at least get, comfortable with a little bit of it. I'm not talking about you have to do statistics to the 90, like just some descriptive statistics. Learn how to write survey questions, learn how to do a sample of a population. That's going to help you so much. It really is, because there are a lot of people I see come into UX research, and this is across the board. This is not any organization in particular I've been in, that researchers that that don't know how to do the quantitative stuff. And I'm telling you, the ones that I see succeed and go up and their ladder or whatever, is typically the people who can do quantitative stuff as well.
So you said descriptive statistics, you've dropped surveys. Is there anything else you're seeing, in the quant space that would be particularly useful?
Learning to use different tools like R, and like, for example, at UNT, we learned SPSS, which is a great program. I have yet to work at a place where we used SPSS just because the federal government could afford it, or we had one license and you had to go sit in an office like across campus. It was like this little closet where they plugged in one computer that would run SPSS for the whole center. It was just a mess. But being able to use different things like, heaven forbid that you have to use Excel to run your statistics, but sometimes that's all you got. Or really learning to use R, which I very badly need to get back on that. I've been learning it for years, and it's just been one of those things that I keep, putting off. But I need to get better at R. Qualtrics, using different tools. Qualtrics is another one of those, though, it's great, but not every organization can afford it. But just being able to use different methods, and that goes to the qualitative stuff as well. Atlas TI is great, or whatever in Vivo that you're used to using. Learn to use other ones, because at some point you're going to be working for an organization that they all use this one, and so you've got to go learn that one.
Yeah, sounds good. How about metrics, analytics? Obviously
Yes.
in Google, I'm sure, they're abounding everywhere. So, you don't have to speak to anything specific that Google uses, but, are you seeing that being asked for?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, because metrics is like what I've probably been doing been the focus of my stuff for probably 6 months, cumulatively. Anyway, yes, part of that quantitative thing that I was talking about, and we need to get better at doing as anthropologists, is definitely metrics, especially if you're going to work in UX, because you're working with engineers who want numbers, who understand numbers, and there's challenges of that, and there's times where we push back on that, yes. But typically, if it's an engineering organization or a tech company, and that's where most UX people go, you're going to be faced with, how do we measure this? And they're going to look to you as the researcher to provide that number. Whether it's right or wrong, they're going to look at you to provide those metrics. So really understanding how you even create metrics. And I think this is, again, where anthropologists can be very good at this, because we're not only trained as researchers, so we understand how to write, something that can be tested and measured. But we also think holistically, and we also think about, like, what is a good OKR or a good success metric for this team? What makes sense for this team? What is meaningful and impactful for users versus just what, somebody said might be a good thing to measure. So yes, metrics is very important.
Thanks for elaborating on that. And so I know we've just talked about a few things that you would recommend, but is there anything I didn't ask about that you think just everybody needs to be thinking about, whether that's how they approach a resume or a portfolio, or additional skills, something like R, but maybe like completely in another space?
Yeah, one thing I would say, especially for new anthropologists or recent grads, or even if for those even still in school, is that when you're writing your resume, just include your work stuff that you've done as a student. If it's a group project you work on, like, I know UNT's program is very good about having class projects and stuff. If you've done any kind of class project, put that in your resume as work done, because that is work that has been done. And don't neglect it just because you did it as a student. Always include that kind of thing. I'll also say, too, to people, especially if you're looking at trying to break into an organization like NASA or something that doesn't have a clear path for hiring, try to intern, or try to, if it even is through a contractor route, doing something that gets you in the door, especially as a recent grad, where, one, you can learn about the different opportunities. Sometimes you may get an internship and learn, oh, this contractor, they employ anthropologists. Well, there you go. But sometimes you don't know that until you become an insider. So, look for internships. And a lot of internships, especially in tech, are paid. And some of them are paid very well. Southwest, you get to fly free. So it's always good. I was an intern, but I was always jealous of them because they got to fly free. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a good perk for sure. Great. And so do you have anything coming up that you'd want anybody to know about, or any organizations that you're just fond of that you want to share?
Yeah, so before I left NASA for good, I guess, for better or worse, I was part of a group called ISS. And this is it's really exciting to be part of this group. It's out of the University College London, where I got my PhD, and headed up by Victor Buckley, who was my supervisor, my PhD supervisor. And it's a group of anthropologists who are basically stationed around the major partners of the International Space Station, and they're doing an ethnography of the International Space Station, hence the name ISS. So they've got some, and I've been a part of this team. I'm still, I guess, on a kind of supervisory or way connected to them. So I'm very excited to see what they've got coming out, because they're getting to the point where they'll be starting to share some findings and stuff from that. So I know they have a session at AAA this year, and there will be much, much more coming out in terms of publications and talks. So I would definitely get people, anybody who's interested in space research or even just ethnography in a very different field site, to pay attention to them. So.
Yeah, great. Sounds really interesting. I'll look forward to seeing that myself. And if anybody wanted to get in touch with you, where would be a good place to find you?
Oh, LinkedIn. I'm Jo Aiken, pretty easy to find.
Very good. Well, Jo, thanks for taking the time today.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.